Hello everybody and welcome back to this tutorial, and right now we're going to enter something called socket programming. Now basically that belongs to the network programming part, and what we're going to do is we're going to actually try to create a simple server and client side code which will be ran on two different PCs, or in our case we can run it from the same PC, so we can actually just check whether it works or not. Now in order to run it on the same PC, we will use the local host IP address, which is 127.0.0.1. We can specify any port we actually want as long as that port is not in use. Now of course, if you have multiple PCs that you want to test this on, feel free to actually change the IP address to the IP address of the server and then perform the connection from one to another PC. Okay, so first of all, what are sockets? Well, sockets are the endpoints of a bidirectional communication channel. Now, sockets may communicate within a process, between processes, on the same machine, or between processes on different continents if that's what you want. Sockets may be implemented over a number of different channel types, now Unix domain sockets, TCP, UDP, and so on and so on. The socket library provides specific classes for handling the common transports, as well as generic interface for handling the rest. Okay, so basically Python provides two levels of access to the network services, and at the low level you can access the basic socket support in the underlying operating system. That basically allows you to implement clients and servers for both connection-oriented and connectionless protocols. Now, connection-oriented is referring to the actual TCP protocol, which actually requires a three-way handshake in order to be able to perform it. And the connectionless protocol is mostly referring to the UDP protocol, which is basically just sending a stream of data without actually wondering whether the data came whole, untagged, or basically whether it came at all into the desired machine. Okay, now Python also has libraries that will provide you with a higher level access to specific application level network protocols such as FTP, HTTP, and so on and so on. Now, but in this section right here, we're going to cover the understanding of the most famous concept in networking, which is a low-level socket programming. That is the basics of the internet themselves. And what we're going to do right now is we're going to take a look at the basic example or a picture of a server and a client. Now what I mean by that is, let me open it right here, is we have two things. One of them is the server and one of them is the client. And this right here are the functions that we need to use in order to perform the connection between each one. The server will be desired to actually create the socket object first. Once it creates the socket object, that socket object needs to take two arguments, and one of those is the actual the actual IP address, and the other one is the port. That's where the bind function comes in use. So basically what we will do is we will bind those two. We will bind the IP address of our own machine that we are listening on, and we will bind the port that we are accepting connections on. As it says right here, this is server creating listening socket, and then it performs the listen function that is inbuilt in the socket library in Python. What this listen function will do is it will listen for the incoming connections, and as soon as the connection comes, the accept function will be called, accepting the connection from the client and therefore establishing the connection via three-way handshake or via TCP protocol. As we can see right here, in the meantime, at the client-side code, the socket object has been created. We have a socket descriptor written to the memory, and therefore we call the connect function, which is going to simply connect to our server. Now, keep in mind that the server and client can just simply be two different machines. You can simply just have two laptops and just pretend that one of those laptops is server and the other one will be a client that wants to connect to that server. Basically the same thing is with websites. You are simply a client accessing this server, which is a website. So once you actually perform the connect function, the accept function will be called right here, and as I said, it will establish a three-way handshake or a TCP connection. As soon as you establish it, you can simply just send the data and receive data between two PCs. with the send and receive command. As we can see, the send command from the client will be client sending data and server receiving data. Now here we need to keep in mind that we don't actually put both the client and the server to send data at the same time or to try to receive data at the same time, because then our programs will crash because nobody is receiving anything and they're both listening for the data at the same time. So that is also something that we need to keep in mind. So the receive and the receive should never go one with another. First of all, we send data and the server receives data. Then if we want to, we can change that and call the send function from the server, while as the receive function will be called at the client side code, which means that the server right now is sending the data and the client is receiving the data with the receive command. Once it actually sends all of those data, and once they want to terminate the connection, they can simply do so, and afterwards we need to close the socket object, and we do that with the close function right here, as we can see right here. So the close function is something that we called at the end of the actual connection. Now there are a few actual terms that we need to take a look at right here in the socket programming. One of those is the domain. Now the domain, basically the family of protocols that is used as a transport mechanism. These values are constants such as, let's say, AF-INET, which is the IPv4, the PF-INET, PF-UNIX, PF-X25, and so on and so on. Now the type of the communications between the two endpoints, typically SOC stream, or which means that the actual connection is via TCP handshake or connection-oriented protocol, and SOC DGRAM, which is for the connectionless protocols, or basically it stands for UDP. Now those are the two that you will most likely encounter all the time. And the next thing is the protocol, which will typically be 0. Now this may be used to identify a variant of a protocol within a domain and type. Okay? The next thing that we need to remember is the actual host name, the identifier of a network interface, basically a string which can be a host name, a dotted quad address, which means that you are simply specifying an IP address or IPv4 address to this specific server, or an IPv6 address in colon, and possibly dot if you want to. A string broadcast will specify an ADDR underscore broadcast address, a zero-length string which identifies in ADDR any, or an integer interpreted as a binary address in host byte order. Okay, and the last thing that we need to take a look at is the actual port. Now each server has its IP address, of course, and once you try to connect to that server, you need to specify to which port are you connecting. Now there are multiple ports, over 65,000, and therefore if you simply just specify the IP address, the programs will not know on which port to listen on. So for example, if you simply specify the server to listen on port 200, and then you from the client don't specify a port and it sends to some random port 300, the server will not receive connection because it was listening on a different port. So each server listens for clients calling on one or more ports if you want to. A port may be a fixed port number, a string containing a port number, or the name of a certain servers running on that port. Okay? Now, we're going to start off by actually creating the socket module or the socket object, pardon me. In the next tutorial, this short tutorial was just about me explaining actually how we can do certain things, how does the server and the client actually work. We can see a visual representation right here of all of the functions that we are going to use. We also discussed some of the things that are important, such as IP addresses, ports, domains, protocols, connectionless, connection-oriented protocols. Now those are also some of the important things, whether you're TCP or UDP server and client. And we're going to continue coding, or we're going to start coding with the socket library in the next tutorial. So hope I see you there and take care. Bye.